Here's the counterpart to the D&Dification video you didn't know was coming. So I talked in that video about how fantasy is kind of getting simplified and tropified, and yet today we're talking about the exact opposite of that. Before we begin, I want to make it abundantly clear that I have exactly zero beef with Brando Sando or any of his fans. Instead, I want to comment merely on the influence of his style on the broader fantasy zeitgeist. I'd actually argue that a key aspect of Brandon Sanderson's writing has had an even greater impact on fantasy writers than what most of D&D or Vancian Magic or any of that has done, and that's what we're going to start with at part 1, Worldbuilding Overabundance. So my channel obviously talks about world building all the time. Half of all the views on this channel are from a single video about world building. And yet I have on repeated occasions acknowledged the fact that world building does not a good story make. It's an aspect of good storytelling, but not the defining characteristic in the way plot, character, and themes can be. Onto our video's actual topic, Brandon Sanderson has a lot of world building. Now, it's not to the point that I think it makes his work worse, but I do think I'll take us on a little side quest and make my stance on him clear right away, just so you know where I'm coming from right from the beginning. Not that my opinion on him actually matters otherwise. I think he's a talented, passionate writer with an eye for detail. That being said, the length of his series and the actual entries in his novels is not to my personal taste. While I primarily write fantasy, I read everything, which I'd very strongly recommend you do too, actually, even if you also only really work on one genre. Fantasy writers who only read fantasy are the prime examples of that fantasy Ouroboros thing I was talking about in previous videos. But that being the case, it's a little difficult for me to be able to get so much out of single novels or series that total at or way less than 300,000 words, and then try to read a 6-novel series in which each entry is about that long. I'm not in any way saying it's bad that that exists, or that you shouldn't like that, or write that even, but it's just not for me. And for that reason, this video isn't so much about Sanderson himself as it is about the people who want to be like him, I suppose it could be said. So back onto the theme of this part of the video, the absolute biggest, bar none, nothing else coming even sort of close problem I see with speculative fiction writers online is that all they ever talk about is their story's world building. There are tons of interesting takes though, from worlds of floating islands to the ancient battlegrounds of long dead gods. There are so many really cool ideas out there, and I really do like hearing about them out in the world or even in my own Discord. And in a vacuum, it's no surprise to see all this around. There are all sorts of places made specifically for discussing world building, including this YouTube channel about half the time. And it's not like I'm the only place this happens. There are subreddits, forums, websites, and all sorts of other resources of varying size, scale, and purpose, which are all in some way about world building. And while Sanderson himself is by no means responsible for this solely, not even close, I do think he's a good figurehead for this. Speaking in total, most of fantasy contributes to this love of world building, both by tradition and by design. Tolkien's world building was legendary for its incredible depth and extent. He had fully realized fictional languages and histories, and that was just the beginning. And that world building is so thoroughly infused into the pages of his works, you could wring them out for hours and still not extract every drop of Middle-earth's design. D&D, of course, also contributes to this, as do the things that inspired D&D, but needing to make a game world for the players necessitates world building because you have to create a space for their characters to occupy, and thus for them to create the story in. Yes, the side characters are the DM's prerogative, but really the DM is mostly a world builder who only otherwise guides the plot, facilitates the protagonists, and only has significant control over the antagonists. So of course, saying Sanderson is the cause for this cult of world building would be quite stupid, but he is still a part of it. And I emphasize again, that is not an inherently bad thing. As with anything in writing, no method is bad in of itself, only in the context of its implementation. Yet all the same, Sanderson is this generation's implementation of fantasy's tendency for long word counts and extensive and in-depth world building. Nothing wrong with that. He's in his element, living his best life and writing what he wants to write. However, I think there's a broader conversation to be had here about the genre itself and the impact that these sorts of things have on the people writing it. And the first of those is something I've noticed about the way world building is handled at scale, which we'll discuss as part 2. The infinite product. With this, we're working a little backwards. I want to talk about this aspect of world building, and then a little later we'll discuss why I think it exists. But essentially, world building is an infinite product when applied to anything a person can interact with online. YouTube videos, very ironically, being a perfect example. There are basically infinite YouTube videos I could make about world building, and that isn't a bad thing per se, because there are infinite things you can do with world building. And despite what this video is about, I still love world building. But the point here is that nobody's ever really finished world building. There are always more things to bring extra depth to. And I know this from experience, and I'll demonstrate it by running you through the pure world-building process of my own verse, removed from the narrative context of the actual novel that it's for. It all started with a grouping of factions I wanted for some sort of trading card game idea I had. Yes, actually. That was back in like middle or high school-ish, so obviously I didn't actually make a trading card game. And those factions were written down in a note-keeping program and then basically forgotten. Then I played Fire Emblem Three Houses and got inspired to actually write a novel and pulled out those old factions. Then I started making them more than just names and gave them some aesthetic themes. I liked Warhammer Fantasy's approach of cleaving closer to history, and so chose to try and do a bit of that and implement some historical details into each of them, which proved to be useful to people I told about it because they'd intuitively sort of understand the factions when I talked about them. But by then I was writing a novel and was more concerned about the one central location there. Then I had to build out to the kingdoms that surrounded that center, and they went from vaguely defined geographic locations to actual political entities with histories. And I made the regions that surrounded those kingdoms because they'd all be affecting each other, because there were almost no places that exist in a pure vacuum, right? And then those places got fleshed out too. Sometimes I'd make a specific map of a region for the tabletop RPG campaigns my friends and I would run in this world. Then I started developing subcultures within each of those broader countries. Then I started making timelines. Then I started making maps of neighboring continents, and so on and on and on and on and on. World building is infinite for the same reason that no one person can ever know everything about every single part of the world, and even when you have your own world that is entirely your creation, if you really want to make it have the depth of a real world, whatever that means, you're going to have this endless pursuit to continue narrowing the lens, getting more and more deep. Going from continent scale to national to regional to city to town to village, neighborhood, building, individual. You can never canvas it all because then you account for time, and you can never actually world build everything, really. And so you never run out of world building to do. Tolkien always could have done more. I have plenty more to do. You'll have plenty more to do. And even if we all spent the remainder of our lives doing nothing but world building, there would always be more details left out or skimmed over. This is why world building is such a good product online. It's great for videos, for website memberships, for forum discussions, whatever it is, because nobody from the newest possible writer to Sanderson himself is ever actually done with it. And once again, to counterbalance, and because I actually really want to emphasize this isn't supposed to be a negative video, nor one trashing anybody, this is to an extent also one of the best parts of world building. I'm going to keep doing it because it's fun. I love developing all these extra little things. Will most of them ever make their way into my novels? No. But that doesn't really matter. To me, it still makes the world feel more real, and if they do come up, these things will be ready. Otherwise, they'll still be there, maybe for some obscure detail in a tabletop RPG campaign or something, and that's fine. However, this phenomenon definitely does have a downside, and it's most pronounced in what we'll call Part 3, the Worldbuilding Loop. There we are, at the end of the day, 3 kinds of world builders. The first are those who world build and write, and get writing done. The second are those who world build and don't write, either because they just like world building by itself or because they don't need to write because their world building is for an RPG or something. The third type is those who world build and write but don't actually write, you know? And that third type, for part 3, which I didn't actually do on purpose, is what we'll be talking about here. So as I just said, world building is a lot of fun. The problem with that is that not only is it fun, but it's also easy and feels productive. And for a writer who's actually trying to get stuff done, that's an extremely dangerous combination. And I'll go ahead and make a bet right off rip. This is why, despite the fact finding fantasy writers is easy online, in actual writers groups I go to in real life, there aren't many fantasy people there. Obviously, part of that is because speculative fiction itself is a niche, but still. One of the most prevalent types of memes amongst writing communities, trust me, this is relevant, are those concerning being a writer who doesn't actually write. And that's the case even divorced from genre. However, speculative fiction does have this extra hurdle, and it's legitimately that world building being fun and feeling productive makes the whole process harder. Making actual progress writing is hard, doubly so in speculative fiction genres where you might be planning out a large series that demands a lot from you. The moves characters are making now might need to be setting up their eventual decisions a book or two from then, and that can make progress slower than it could be writing other genres. So it ends up being fairly natural for, in that situation, someone to do a little writing, struggle to get into that mystical and beloved flow state, and decide, yeah, I'll just do some world building, and then easily spend like 4 hours developing the deep and intricate history of Backwateria down to the exact cutoffs and exemptions for their tax brackets. Do this for long enough and a great world may well be developed. A long and storied history with twists, turns, and all sorts of interesting concepts thrown in, but only like 30 pages of actual prose. And why is it that it's so much easier to world build? Well, I just think it's because it's without pressure and without expectation. You can just throw in cool ideas, and if you're worried people will think they're dumb, then you don't have to worry about showing off that particular aspect. You don't have to worry about character motivations because the people involved in the world building only matter and exist so far as they do the things you write them as having done. And thus, whatever they did was in character because all their character is the implementer of whatever action you wrote them as having done. It makes the things that are hard about prose writing easy. Historical events are just plots without having to worry about exactly how they happened or how odds were overcome. The psychic distance between the reader and the events means they don't have to be explained or justified in the same way. All this time, it feels like you're making progress because you're doing something that's very well related to your project. The things you're doing might come up at some point later on. The fictional war you wrote about may well be a natural thing for a character to bring up a few chapters from where you're at. But that only matters if enough actually gets written to get you there in the first place, and if it was a situation in which you couldn't have made something up on the spot anyway. Because at the end of the day, a lot of world building isn't that many steps above coming up with something spontaneously when you do need some character to reference a past event. There are plenty of times when having some lore pre-prepared is super useful, but I only said what I did because even at its primary practical purpose, extensive world building doesn't always succeed or prove itself necessary. So, while world building is what sets fantasy and sci-fi writers apart, I do find it's often a little bit of a trap. But to get even broader scale, I want to talk about the genre as a whole with part 4, the Nicheness Factor. Now, there are millions and millions of people who love sci-fi and fantasy, no denying that. They aren't hidden nor niche in the way they might have been a few decades ago. But on a broader scale, they are genres that will probably always be less popular than what us fans of these genres see as the sort of less interesting contemporary types. The fact is that all 3 of the original Lord of the Rings movies got only a little more than half the box office success than Titanic did by itself. And I'm not even trying to throw shade at Titanic, that's just how it is. But recently, I got a little insight. Probably not a full understanding per se, but a good piece of knowledge as to why our genres aren't more popular. I was in a workshop just a few days before writing the script, and I was having the very beginning of the first novel in my series workshopped once again because I wanted to make sure it was perfect. And one of the people in there said something along the lines of, "I liked your piece because it didn't make me feel stupid. Most high fantasy makes me feel stupid." And to start, I'm not saying this to try and make it seem like I'm some paragon of the genre, because for whatever other flaws my writing might have, my primary goal was to get a response kind of like that. So for me, that was just like her saying, well, you did do the one thing you were specifically trying to do kind of well. But in any case, the reason I bring it up is because I know that person sort of well, She's not by any means stupid, and her own writing is really good and very strong in personality. But I understood exactly what she meant when she said that high fantasy makes her feel stupid, and I think the cult of world building, as I'm calling it because it's a fun title, is probably the main culprit. Sure, these genres we write are known for their flowery, antiquated language, but to be completely honest, that's a bit of a skill issue if that becomes a problem. It is more than possible to write in ways that fit the setting, but don't make people want to tear their eyes out. But I would be willing to talk about that more in a video if need be. But it's the overwhelming world building, the proliferation of titles and countries and weird names and magic systems and old wars and noble families and magical substances and locations, and all that, it's just a little bit overwhelming to the person who in their everyday life interacts with Bill and Sasha from Sacramento and reads about John and Jane from New York. You might say, but J-Bat, fantasy is meant to be fantastical and nothing like real life. That's a totally valid point. But the idea here is that this kind of world building taken to these extremes and these already long entries and extended groups of novels are going to create these situations where only people really dedicated to reading the genre are going to have any interest in learning, say, the 2,700 names of all the characters in the Wheel of Time. But I don't want to tell you not to do it, not to world build the things you want to. That's tantamount to giving up, and I detest that. So instead, I think the solution more so lies in that I want to emphasize making things accessible. Not dumbed down, not simplified, but accessible. Draw comparisons, introduce concepts at digestible rates, and be considerate of the way things will be perceived. If you have 3 characters with 2-syllable S names in the first 3 pages, some of those should probably be changed because it's going to be confusing. I don't really think we're ever going to make these genres as popular as those conventional narratives that take place in conventional places on conventional Earth. But I do think we can crack the door open a little more so that those curious about these genres can take a peek inside and not immediately get booted out for not being able to pronounce Thrinvig Shafarin Phlegma Karnagoth the first time they see it. Anyway, the Sanderson thing was a bit of a bait and switch, I apologize, but I do think he symbolizes this discussion within the fantasy genre, even if I ended up not really making the video about him, for that primary reason that I don't blame nor dislike him for these things I'm talking about. But with all that in mind, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any thoughts of your own about the cult of world building, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every like and subscription goes a long way. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank our patrons. Shadowrunner Sani and Isaac Parrott, our Knights of the Inner Circle, Nico, our Knight, and Greer, our Loyal Squire. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and remember, the next time you find yourself about to world build instead of write, remember this video.